This park, Twin Springs, and another, Seaver Springs, were engineered in the 1930s as fish rearing stations. Their construction was part of a federal response to an economic crash and environmental catastrophe. The 10th chapter of my book, Aiding the Land, looks at the new public awareness of the need for conservation between World War I and World War II. I look at the personal engagement my grandfather, Stuart Baker, had with land conservation, and the way my parents, who grew up on creeks that fed the Upper Iowa, related to the land. The headlines of the local paper tell it all: a devastated farm economy, and the soil of the Great Plains blowing away from the land and onto the furniture of Northeast Iowa homes. Under FDR, the federal government put people back to work, in part by investing in conservation projects like these field terraces that stop erosion. FDR's programs improved the farm economy by paying farmers to quit overproducing and to take eroding farmland out of production. In the meantime, the internal combustion engine inspired its own regional oil exploration, in part to fuel stations like this one at Canoe, Iowa, where my teenage father pumped gas. Here are some questions. How did the internal combustion engine change people's sense of connection to the land? And 2, conservation efforts in the Depression often focus on soil and water. What were the benefits of this to farmers, the environment, and the economy? The title of The Juice, Chapter 11, refers to 2 new arrivals in the Upper Iowa Basin countryside after World War II, electricity and chemicals. In this chapter, I look at the farm life of my Aunt Alice and her husband Fred, and their response to the death of their son Alan, a death they blamed on herbicide use. Up against Fred and Alice's farm history just following World War II, I place their son John's current use of the land, in particular his shift from conventional farming using herbicides to organic farming. I include a story about my own family's loss of sheep, poisoned by copper acetoarsenite. In this period, pesticides like DDT were promoted for residential as well as commercial use. Public awareness of the environmental toll of pesticides was raised in particular by Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring, a book that looks at how water carries contaminants through the landscape. The period I survey in this chapter is the dawn of the environmental movement, signed into federal law by Richard Nixon. The Upper Iowa River, becoming a favorite of canoers, was studied for nomination as a federal wild and scenic river, a nomination that failed. And the river was re-engineered to protect Decorah and the last miles of floodplain before the Mississippi from regular flooding. Even as power dams that once harnessed the river for electric power were taken out of commission, the countryside was electrified, a change that helped allow farms to increase in size. Some questions. By the 1960s, concern about chemical pollutants came to overshadow concern about soil loss into streams. Why? What new connections became apparent in this era? 2. What are the ways pesticide use touches your life, other people's lives, and the lives of plants and animals with whom we share the world? And 3. There was not enough political will to make the Upper Iowa a national scenic river. How would you explain this?
Whoa, 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 whoa,
In the final chapter, On the Farm by the River They Raise Children, I profile two farm families whose land use is strongly affected by their concern for water quality. Paul and Pat Johnson and their partner, son Andy, and Dan and Bonnie Beard and their kids. By this point in the book, you know there are plenty of concerns about forces that threaten the quality of the upper Iowa: soil erosion, chemical runoff, bacterial contamination, and unwise development, to name a few. These two families are examples of a shift, often against the grain of market forces, government policy, and a system that makes it easy to forget water quality. Paul Johnson authored Iowa's 1987 Groundwater Protection Act, in part to protect water quality threatened by agricultural developments such as confined animal feeding operations like this one. Laura Friest is the first Upper Iowa Rivershed Project coordinator who worked to pull together efforts from many groups to protect the river. In 1990, Iowa granted the Upper Iowa Protected Water Area status, a designation that so far has not been of much substantial help. Farm policies continue to push for high levels of land tillage, spraying, and production, Iowa mountains of corn, which Paul Johnson would like to counter with a federal program that pays for conservation that protects the whole land community for future generations. Here are some questions. Where do you consider the impacts on water quality in your own daily choices? 2. How does your consumption of food and agricultural products, or your voice in Washington, connect to water quality in rivers like the Upper Iowa? And 3. How has reading about the river valley affected your sense of connection to this place, or to the place you call home?
whoa.